Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us again today for Pacific Research Institute's Young Leaders Circle Speaker Series. It's a ongoing interview series that we're doing with folks in government, policy, think tanks, emerging industries to talk about, how they got to where they are, their experience. And today we have a great guest. We're going to cover a lot of fun public policy topics and even talk about some of the transitions going on at the federal level. Today we have Halie Craig. Halie is with R Street Institute. She's a fellow and she also works at Facebook. Halie, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So let's jump right in. We had talked before, and one of the themes we wanted to touch on, and maybe folks need to go back to their government and AP government classes in high school, is Article 1 in checks and balances of the executive branch and legislative branch. You've talked a lot about how there's been a decay from Congress's power and how that's bled into the more power the president has, whether that's executive orders. Can you kind of give us a background, and then we'll talk specific policy issues about where this is playing out?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And just to give some additional context here, prior to becoming an associate fellow at R Street and my current job in tech, I spent a little over 3 years in the Senate right out of college working on various policy issues. And I was primarily in the office of Senator Pat Toomey in that capacity. So I was able to see firsthand some of the, I guess I would call them abrogations of legislative authority to the executive branch, and how that has really complicated federal policymaking, in my view, to the detriment of the average constituent. So what we've seen, and for folks that are history buffs, there's so many great books out there that detail this kind of shift of legislative power, so to speak,
Yep.
from Congress to the executive and to an extent to the courts. But I think you can probably target a lot of it towards pinpoint at the beginning of the 20th century, with especially the Wilson administration, as well as the New Deal, where we just saw this really broad expansion of federal policy, and Congress over time delegating pretty vague authorities to federal agencies, and agencies under the Chevron deference doctrine that the Supreme Court put out in 1984.
Mm-hmm.
The courts have largely given their blessing to administrative agencies to interpret delegations from Congress, even if those delegations are quite vague. And I think we've seen that. I mean, one statistic, just to frame this up for people, that I find really fascinating is, under the way that obviously the framers conceptualized our system of government, we have three branches that are supposed to act as checks and balances on one another. And it's interesting because you look at, the presidency and the White House did not used to have the same amount of policymaking weight that we put on it today. There's so much less pressure, I think, on Congress to get things done, because people know, okay, we just vote in a president of our choice and he or she can enact as much as possible through executive orders or through agency rulemaking.
Yep.
There's a really big staffing imbalance here too. So over time, and this is, I think, roughly where things are at now, the executive branch has 2 million employees, not including the armed forces, covering about 200 different agencies. Congress, which represents the same swath of individuals, the entire United States, has 17,000 employees. And so there's a pretty big deficit in terms of just capacity to engage in policymaking. What's also interesting is, the founders thought that each branch of government would jealously guard their power, and therefore Congress was probably going to be most likely to try and usurp power from other branches, and is therefore one of the weaker branches in terms of having some of its own internal checks and balances. Like, we have a bicameral legislature, but what happened over time was the exact opposite, which is fascinating, but also has created a lot of problems in our system.
I think your point of the explosion in staff on the executive side, I think of like, was it the military industrial complex? It's kind of like a executive branch industrial complex that just took off. And you're right, it's taken over policy initiatives. It's taken over much of that congressional responsibility. Do you think there's something, I mean, I was thinking, since Obama and Trump, we've had very heavy-handed policymaking done through executive order. I think most Americans or folks following government are used to that now. Of a lot of things are done now. You sidestep Congress, you sign an executive order, and then you fight in the courts. Beyond that past 12 years of that, was there another instance, 20th century, maybe under Bush, that really like ramped up this overtaking of Congress and how the executive has really just taken front and center in all these policy initiatives?
I mean, I think there are numerous examples you can point to over time. I mean, war powers is obviously one. Congress is supposed to have the authority to declare war. And then under Obama, I would say immigration is probably a really key example with the DACA program, setting aside, moral arguments and merits, the way that the program was created by executive decree, essentially. And the Constitution is so explicit about these things, which is what's really crazy. Article 1 of the Constitution specifically vests Congress with the authority to declare war, with taxation authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations, with immigration powers. And what we've seen over time is the executive has really become the primary instrument in all of these spaces. Yeah. And you see a shocking amount, or shockingly little amount, of resistance from Congress when the executive abuses its authority. And I don't know necessarily why, but I suspect a lot of it is partisanship. Because if it's your party in power that's doing the rulemaking, I think you're less inclined to push back on Article 1 grounds, because at least you're getting the policies you want enacted, if even for a short period of time. I mean, most of my work was I used to handle immigration, actually, so I saw a little bit of that, but most of my work on the Hill centered on trade policy. And as I think people know, tariffs are taxes. They're paid by the importers of foreign goods. Mm-hmm. And tariff power, as well as taxation power, is very explicitly vested with Congress, as is power of the purse. What we've seen over the past 4 years is a very creative use of these very old statutes that Congress wrote during like the Cold War. There's another one called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which was even based on an even older statute. And what we've seen is like the executive branch basically reinterpret some of the language in these statutes and realize, oh, wow, like Congress actually delegated us this really broad authority and didn't even define the parameters for which we can use it. And that's how the Trump administration has been able to unilaterally impose taxes on importers of goods like steel and aluminum, threaten them on the auto industry, investigate imports of uranium, titanium sponge, cranes, all kinds of things. And it's also why we have tariffs on nearly, I think it's about 75% or so of the goods that we import from China now.
Yeah, I was going to say lamps, screws, I mean, you name it. I feel like it was in
cribs.
Yes, cribs.
Small motors are a big one too, because almost everything that has a tiny motor in it, the motors come from China. So we, like, if you there's a fan manufacturer in Pennsylvania that needs the motors, and it's just like very weird. You learn a lot about supply chains and how we even we get all these components from China. It's not even necessarily the finished goods in a lot of cases.
What was there anything, we're coming out of 4 years of Trump I always called it, a trade policy by tweet, basically, like everything else.
Well, it kind of was.
Yeah. Are there one or two things that coming out of the 4 years of the many maybe that stood out, whether maybe it was USMCA, maybe it was, I guess the part one deal they got done with China, but I feel like that disappeared. I mean, is there anything that sticks out as we're headed into a new administration and probably a new path?
Yeah, I think there are two examples, I guess, that are particularly illustrative here. And the first is Section 232, which is this Cold War statute that basically gives the executive power to impose tariffs in the name of national security. But the statute doesn't define national security. Interestingly, it's actually not really defined anywhere in the US code.
Okay.
And so, but because of this, the Commerce Department is essentially vested with the ability to define what national security means. And they've done so quite broadly to include like the economic health of the United States. So sure. General welfare is all of a sudden national security for the purposes of imposing tariffs on goods. And even with the steel and aluminum. So this is authority that was used for the steel and aluminum tariffs. And the Commerce Department decided, there's a national security threat that we import steel and aluminum. The president imposed those tariffs. And the Defense Department completely disagreed, but they just didn't have the authority under the statute to say this is not a good idea.
Yeah.
So that's one. And those tariffs, like, to be clear, are still in place on almost all of our trading partners. Canada and Mexico did get some deal under the new NAFTA agreement. And then we've entered into quota agreements with a handful of countries, but we still have them on a ton of allies. And it really it makes, manufacturing in the US more expensive. There are a lot more workers in downstream industries than there are in steel and aluminum. I think it's like, the numbers are maybe 140,000 in direct production and 6.5 million in downstream production. So it's a huge delta in terms of the workers that are being negatively impacted by these tariffs. And it's also just damaging our relationships with allies and our ability to enter into beneficial trading agreements with new trading partners. So that was frustrating. And then I think the other piece we saw was USMCA and collaboration with Congress in negotiating trade agreements. So historically, Congress, again, has been vested with trade authority under the Constitution. Congress really kind of messed up in 1930, as people know, with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which raised average tariffs on a good portion of goods and is credited by some economists as being a contributing factor to the Great Depression.
Yep.
One thing that I find really fascinating about the legislative history of Smoot-Hawley is that over a 6-month period, it was amended about 1,200 times in the Senate because there was so much vote trading among members. Like, hey, if I can raise the tariff on this good from my district, or my state, I'll vote for you to raise the tariff on this item from your state. So it just became like this.
Everybody was
log rolling of like protectionist amendments and provisions. And so that was really not good. And then partly as a result of that, over time, Congress began to delegate conditional authority to the executive branch to enter into trade agreements with foreign nations, which to an extent makes sense. It is helpful to have a unitary, like, executive negotiating agreements on behalf of the entire United States. And so, but like at the end of the day, Congress should be approving these trade agreements. And that's what this authority called Trade Promotion Authority is for. It's basically this handshake agreement between the executive and Congress, although it is in law, where Congress says to the executive, hey, you can go and negotiate trade agreements like a renegotiated NAFTA, and we'll guarantee you a vote and it'll get voted on in a timely manner, but we still have to vote on it. And that agreement, Trade Promotion Authority, is supposed to have protections for Congress. It is supposed to guarantee that Congress is kept in the loop with negotiations. Members of Congress are supposed to have substantive input, because trade agreements like the new NAFTA deal necessitate sometimes changes to US law. There's also legislation that is unamendable once the executive submits it to Congress, which is kind of wild if you think about it, like the White House being allowed to write a bill that can't be amended under congressional rules. So historically, the revenue committees, Ways and Means and Finance, Senate Finance, have been able to provide a lot of input on that legislation. But what we saw with USMCA was, I think a lot of members did not feel like they were really adequately consulted, and especially the Senate. And you heard, Senator Cornyn even grumble about this to a reporter, saying that Senate was treated, I think he said, in a lousy way, because a small group of Democrats in the House essentially negotiated all these changes to the new agreement, and then it was jammed through the Senate quite quickly under Trade Promotion Authority, what we would call fast track rules. But I think the crux of this is really that balance between the executive and Congress here. Like, Congress was really not in the loop. The executive, if you ask most members, and especially the Senate, was not in the loop. So we ended up with a trade agreement that is relatively regressive in terms of free trade, and took us a step back in a lot of respects from where we were with NAFTA, if you are a supporter of free trade, of course.
We are. And well, I think, when USMCA was passed, I think obviously the White House was very excited about it, yet everyone else seemed very ho-hum. I think it was, in a way, and I'm no expert on it. I probably couldn't tell you too many differences between NAFTA, but I think everyone felt like it was just it's like a NAFTA 2.0, and maybe not a better or worse. It was just there. And that, it leads me to, when Trump came into office, I think it was in 2017, we pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Do you think under a Biden, a new administration, is there going to be a shot for another TPP or type of deal of that, whether it's Southeast Asia or maybe something renegotiated with Europe? Or do you think a lot of these changes we saw during Trump are going to be rolled back or removed?
Yeah, so TPP is I think a tough one if you ask most trade analysts. It was obviously a huge agreement and took years of negotiating.
Yep.
And notably, it doesn't include China. So when this question comes up in the trade community about what we should do with China, because I think there's relatively wide agreement that the President Trump's phase one deal with China is not really doing much. It was basically a purchase agreement for agricultural producers that were already selling a good amount to China under the free markets, right? But the hurdles to getting the US back into TPP, I think, would be quite high, because I believe Biden has said that he would renegotiate aspects of TPP, which is kind of the playbook that President Trump used with NAFTA. Like, okay, I'm not going to pull out, but we really need to renegotiate aspects of this agreement. And Democrats got a lot of the things that they really wanted from their trade wish lists in the new NAFTA deal. So primarily strengthened provisions on labor and environment. There's a new dispute settlement mechanism for the US to basically place tariffs on Mexico if there are labor violations happening. We also basically took out this provision called investor state dispute settlement, which allows American investors to sue a foreign government in an international arbitration setting if their rights have been violated. So it protects US companies, but also it protects the pensions of Americans that are invested in those companies. So it's on net a good thing, I think, for the United States. And we took that out of USMCA, and it exists in TPP. So there are a number of things that I think Democrats would want renegotiated. And some of the Republican opposition to TPP was around biologics and the data exclusivity period for these drugs. And pharmaceuticals was also a big issue with USMCA, and Democrats and Republicans are very misaligned on that particular issue. And I think that would also be a real struggle with TPP. Essentially, like the Biden administration would just have to invest a lot of political capital in TPP. And I think it would be very hard to get through Congress politically. And you would also need to renew the fast track legislation, which expires in, I think, July of 2021 as a precursor. So it's tricky. I don't have a crystal ball on this one.
No,
it just will be a lot of work.
No, it would. And that's a good point. I, if I'm not mistaken, several countries did kind of do a break-off version of TPP.
RCEP. Well.
Yes, exactly. So
it was signed on
ratification.
Sunday. Yes, and that one includes China.
Yes.
I have not. There are some analyses of RCEP I need to read, so I won't say I'm an expert on all the provisions. But it is interesting to see, all these countries kind of moving forward without the United States in the room. And it's another thing that kind of came up at the beginning of the Trump administration. And that we've kind of seen throughout the president's trade policies, he would say he didn't like multilateral deals, he liked bilateral deals. Mm-hmm. And so instead of, joining the TPP, he pulled out of the TPP, but then he went and negotiated a mini deal with Japan, which is a member of the TPP. So, and Canada and Mexico are obviously in the TPP as well. So I don't know, it's just interesting. I think with Biden, we'll see, if not rejoining the TPP, which again, I think is just a really high hurdle, but something a lot of people would like to see. It just is logistically quite complex. I think we will see at least a greater pivot towards multilateralism. And that could be just through re-engaging at the World Trade Organization, maybe pulling back some of the tariffs on our allies, although there are political concerns there because there are some domestic beneficiaries now of those tariffs. And then I think with the big change may be just certainty. And that was the main complaint really that we would hear from businesses that were affected by trade under the Trump administration was just uncertainty, and the market hates it. So with NAFTA versus USMCA, a lot of the provisions that were added to the new NAFTA deal are not good for trade. They're quite regressive. Again, we don't have the investor state dispute settlement. We have extremely stringent rules for automakers now in North America. We have a sunset provision on that agreement. So it literally goes away in 16 years unless all three parties just say, yep, sure, it's fine as is. We want to stay in it. But on the flip side, the president was threatening to pull out of NAFTA altogether. We felt strongly in the Toomey office that he did not have that legal authority, but he was threatening it nonetheless. And I think just the threats themselves to upend supply chains are enough to have a chilling effect on free enterprise. And I think I suspect, right, President Biden is not going to be tweeting about tariffs. Hopefully not. And I think that will help. The episode that really scared everyone was, and you may or may not recall this, but it was a big thing in the trade community. I think it was last spring, the president was unhappy with Mexico's enforcement of his immigration policies. Mm-hmm. He was unhappy with the border security issue and basically woke up one morning and tweeted that he was going to start placing tariffs on all imports from Mexico, starting at 5% and ratcheting it up, presumably under a statute called IEPA, again, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is just a very broad economic authority that's historically been used for sanctions and only used for tariffs once. And that, I think, really freaked everyone out because all of a sudden it wasn't just, okay, we're using these tariffs as leverage to negotiate, whether or not you buy these arguments. These were the arguments that were made, right? Sure. We're using the tariffs as leverage to negotiate deals. We're using the tariffs to help our industries. It's a protectionist thing. We want to help steel be more competitive, et cetera. What happened with the tweets about Mexico and tariffs on Mexico is like, we were all of a sudden going to be using tariffs to achieve a completely unrelated policy aim.
Yep.
And I think that is the shift that like we saw under President Trump, is tariffs becoming this like kind of catch-all tool to try and get other countries to do things we want, or to achieve, again, generally not related to trade policy aims. And under a Biden administration, I don't know if we'll see that continue. It's possible, because this idea of using tariffs to address climate change has been floated. And that's obviously going to be a key priority of the incoming administration. So now that the Pandora's box has been opened on tariffs, and Congress has, there have been bills introduced, and I worked on one in the Toomey office, but we didn't have a vote on it. And so up until now, even though President Trump really pushed the envelope on use of tariffs, Congress hasn't been able to really step in and completely repudiate the use of tariffs. And if I were the Biden administration, I'd be looking at that and saying, okay, like we can get away with this.
Well, I think you're right. And I think the last 4 years, I don't know if it's the spotlight that tariffs wanted, but it definitely became, much like many things, it became weaponized again. I'm thinking of other kind of bizarre things that Trump would use to weaponize. There's the Foreign Service and Investment, and they used that to go after Chinese investment in the U.S. and change that, and TikTok, and I'm thinking, all these little things that to us or to previous administrations were not meaningless, but they were in the weeds, became, whether you want to call it a bigger plan or just kind of what Trump was feeling when he woke up one morning. I think you're right. I don't think it'll continue, but the uncertainty, every day was like that. So I think the trade and a lot of the other that I think it might calm down and may be boring again, which might not be a bad thing in the long run. I want to come back to, we were talking about Article 1. Is there any way Congress can pull back any power? Are we kind of too far gone? I kind of think of things as, there's Congress, there's the presidency, and then there's kind of, I think of like the last roadblock is the Supreme Court. Yeah. And then after they've said it, it's kind of like, okay, the chips have fallen. Here's where they are. Is there a way Congress can get some of that Article 1 power back?
Sure. The most obvious route would be for Congress to claw it back itself. But I just think that's unlikely, in part because, like I said before, when it's your party that's in the White House, you're less likely to want to repudiate the actions of the executive. And I think there's definitely a liberal conservative split here, where liberals are more favorable of executive rulemaking and executive power in general. What I would say is I think, and I don't know how likely this actually is, but it would be nice, would be if the Supreme Court would revive non-delegation. And so basically, under the Constitution, one agency cannot just like completely delegate its powers to another branch. Sorry, one branch can't delegate its powers to another branch of government. But historically, Congress has done this in pretty vague ways, and they've met I think it's like the intelligible principle test under non-delegation, as long as there is some justification and some parameters for the delegation, like in the example of trade, like, hey, Commerce Department, you can define national security and then go put tariffs on stuff. It's been upheld by the Supreme Court. And it's unfortunate because President Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminum were actually challenged under non-delegation. And there was Supreme Court precedent in, I think it was the Algonquin case. if anyone's curious and wants to look it up, upholding the use of Section 232 under non-delegation. But what we saw was like, the Trump administration really took that delegation and ran with it in a way we had not seen before. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court declined to hear that case. But I think you'll continue to see cases brought, that are litigated up to the Supreme Court that bring into question non-delegation. And the Supreme Court could say, technically, if they were willing to reverse the decision in Algonquin, actually this legislative power that was delegated to commerce in the White House on trade is not sufficient. It violates non-delegation. It's too broad. And then that would affect that. I mean, that would have ripple effects in terms of various statutes that would be invalidated. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, obviously we have a much more conservative Supreme Court now, but there are even ideological splits among the conservatives on the balance of power issue and what the authority of the executive is. So time will tell. I think the most likely avenue for fixing this imbalance of power, though, is likely the Supreme Court, to be honest.
It always falls to them. I don't know how. And also too, if we're going into the new year, control the House, control the White House by Democrats. You're right. Maybe they don't want to touch it right now. Maybe in 4 years, or if the House changes in 2 or 4 years, maybe that could come up again. But I think you're right. Of maybe if your people are in the White House, maybe you want to be hands off until you don't like something too. Well, let's transition a bit as we're running out of time. I want to talk a little bit about you, and a big part of this series we're doing is, advice for folks that, they want to work in Congress, they want to work for a think tank or Facebook. What advice would you give somebody, whether that's a program, maybe seeking a mentor? I mean, what would you have if somebody wanted to follow your path? What's some advice you would give them?
Yeah. And I hope this is helpful, but this has just been kind of my personal experience. I mean, I did the whole move to DC after college without a job thing, which I think is quite common here. And then got my start on the Hill, which I think I highly recommend. I think it's a great starting point for anyone that's young and wants to get into politics. So I started as a staff assistant and worked my way up to a legislative assistant running trade policy, which was so interesting. And I just learned so much. But I think some of the key things here that I found to be helpful is always prepare for the conversations you have with people. Do your research. So many people are, good at networking and meeting new people. And I think folks in DC are usually always willing to talk to you and give you advice and mentor you. And I've certainly benefited from that because it's kind of the path that everyone has taken here. But you will stand out so much more if you're actually preparing and have thoughtful questions and are, just like the small manner things like sending thank you notes and emails and following up with people and being respectful of people's time and just treating everyone well will get you very far. I also recommend, being open-minded about policy issues that you'd want to work on. So I think a lot of, and this is just a trend that I think we probably both have seen, but a lot of young graduates come out of college wanting to work on usually foreign policy issues, to be honest, because they're fun. And that's where I was too. I was actually a Middle East studies minor and I lived in Jordan for a year. I learned Arabic. So obviously coming to DC, I was like, oh, well, I have this whole background in Middle East politics. And obviously that is not what I'm doing now. But that's because I was just open to learning. And there's so many interesting policy issues to like kind of sink your teeth into in DC. And so be open, especially at the beginning, about getting a breadth of experience rather than specializing, because learning to think across policy areas is actually a really, really valuable skill in DC. And I originally wasn't even doing trade policy for Senator Toomey, and just picked it up one day, and it ended up becoming, and I didn't know that much about it, and it ended up becoming a great experience for me. And I learned a lot from doing it. And even my international background was somewhat helpful in doing trades. So these things kind of converge. But again, I think, being open to learning new experiences, preparing, don't go into a conversation unprepared, treat everyone well. And I think those are the main things I would say.
No, that's great advice. And I like the be open to other policies. I worked in the California state legislature for 6 years, and I think much like how you stumbled into trade, I stumbled into water policy, and I didn't know anything about it, and slowly started picking up in it. But when I left the legislature, I worked at a PR firm for 2 years, and all I worked on was water, and loved it. And it was one of those things, though, if you're not open, I didn't know one thing about water coming in, and I started at the bottom. But I think
likewise, I'm in tech policy now, and I didn't do tech in the Senate. I did trade. But if you learn how to think like a policymaker and approach issues from a principles perspective, that helps a lot. So I also recommend just like reading, especially for conservatives who may be watching, just reading some of the more fundamental books about like free market economics and conservative thinking. I would recommend Free to Choose by Milton and Rose Friedman as a good intro. Conservative Sensibility by George Will is a new one that's quite good. And that, just having that framework to think about issues is helpful.
We'll make you write a book list for people to read for lockdown 2021.
Oh, I'm happy to do so.
All right. Well, this is a great conversation. And thanks for coming on. And I always say to guests, 6 months, 9 months, a year later, I always love to have people back and look at, where's trade at, where's maybe tech at, and have another conversation. But thanks for coming on today, Halie. We really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.